You're standing in the shadows of Westminster Abbey, and the year is 1761. The crowds are cheering, the bells are ringing, and history is about to witness one of the most catastrophic wedding nights ever recorded. But you don't know that yet. All you can see is the radiant bride, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, walking down the aisle toward her destiny. What you're about to discover will shock you to your core and change everything you thought you knew about royal marriages. Picture this: the most powerful throne in Europe, brought to its knees not by war, not by revolution, but by a single night of extreme anxiety that would haunt a kingdom for decades. This isn't just another royal wedding story. This is the tale of how one bride's wedding night distress created a scandal so devastating that it would ultimately contribute to the collapse of an entire royal lineage. You see, royal wedding nights weren't private affairs back then. They were political events, witnessed by physicians, church officials, and court attendants whose job was to verify that the marriage was properly consummated. But what happened in that chamber on September 8, 1761, was so disturbing that every single witness was sworn to secrecy under discomfort of death. The bride was Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a young German princess who had never met her husband before their wedding day. She'd been chosen specifically for her innocence, her fertility, and her complete ignorance of what royal married life actually entailed. The court physicians had examined her thoroughly and declared her perfectly suited for royal motherhood. But here's what they didn't tell Charlotte. They didn't tell her about King George III's condition. George III, the man who would later be remembered as the Mad King who lost America, was hiding a medical secret so shameful that it had been concealed from every potential bride across Europe. The king suffered from a rare condition that modern medicine would recognize as a severe case of phimosis, complicated by what court physicians described as a hidden affliction that made intimacy extremely difficult. Think about this for a moment. You're a sheltered young princess. You've been raised in convents and tutored by elderly women who told you that marital relations were a woman's duty to endure in silence. Your only preparation for your wedding night was a brief, terrifying conversation with your mother, who simply said, "Close your eyes, pray to God, and it will be over soon." Now, imagine discovering that your new husband's anatomy was so abnormal that specially trained physicians had to be present just to make intimacy possible. The wedding ceremony itself was magnificent. Westminster Abbey had never seen such splendor. Charlotte looked radiant in cloth of gold, her train carried by 12 noble ladies, her face glowing with the naive happiness of a girl who believed she was living in a fairy tale. George III, for his part, seemed almost normal, charming even, as he smiled at his young bride and made appropriate royal gestures to the cheering crowds. But fairy tales end when the castle doors close. The first sign that something was wrong came when Charlotte's ladies-in-waiting were dismissed early from the bridal preparation. This was unusual. Royal brides traditionally received extensive guidance and support from experienced women who would explain what was expected of them. Instead, Charlotte found herself alone with a small army of male physicians who spoke in whispers and carried leather cases filled with instruments she didn't recognize. Dr. William Hunter, the king's personal physician, approached the terrified bride with what he would later describe in his private notes as the most delicate conversation of my medical career. He had to explain to Charlotte that her husband's condition required special preparations, special equipment, and above all, special courage on her part. You can imagine the ordeal spreading across Charlotte's face as doctor. Hunter opened his medical cases and began showing her special preparations, still classified, were ordered before the doors closed. Various medical supplies and unfamiliar equipment surrounded the royal bedchamber. "Your Majesty," Dr. Hunter reportedly said, according to notes discovered in 1987, "the king's anatomy presents certain challenges that require medical intervention to ensure the continuation of the royal line. You must understand that this is not unusual among European royalty, and with proper preparation, the process can be made tolerable." But Charlotte wasn't listening to his reassurances. She was staring at the apparatus being arranged around the royal bed, and her mind was starting to break. What happened next was witnessed by 6 people. Doctor Hunter, his assistant, Doctor George Baker, 2 midwives, a chaplain, and a secretary whose job was to document the successful consummation for political purposes. All 6 signed legal documents swearing never to reveal what they witnessed, but their private papers tell a different story. When King George III entered the bridal chamber, Charlotte's first glimpse of her husband in his natural state sent her into what the physicians documented as a severe panic attack. The King's member, described in clinical terms that somehow made it sound even more horrifying, was not just unusually large but so affected by his medical condition that court doctors were called in silence. The young queen began crying out, not the genteel protests of a nervous bride, but the shocked exclamations that deeply unsettled everyone present. Her ladies-in-waiting, waiting outside the chamber, later reported that the sounds coming from the royal bedroom were unlike anything they had ever heard from a human throat. Dr. Hunter's notes, written in Latin to disguise their content, describe Charlotte's condition as overwhelming fear that shook her entire being. What he meant, in language too delicate for his era, was that Charlotte's extreme anxiety overwhelmed every royal courtesy. The bride, who had walked down Westminster Abbey's aisle in cloth of gold, was now cowering in a corner of her bridal chamber, covered in her own waist, crying out warnings about monsters and devils. But here's where this story gets truly dark. The marriage had to be consummated. The political alliance with Mecklenburg-Strelitz depended on it. The succession of the British throne required it, and King George III, already showing early signs of the madness that would later define his reign, became obsessed with completing his royal duty regardless of his bride's extreme anxiety. What followed was less a wedding night than a private royal protocol conducted under the most horrifying circumstances imaginable. Medical intervention, deemed indispensable by the palace, was used to secure an heir behind closed doors. And the entire nightmare was documented minute by minute in sealed chronicles that were immediately sealed and hidden in the deepest vaults of the royal archives. The physical distress was severe enough. Charlotte suffered serious after-effects that required weeks of recovery. But the psychological damage was far worse. From that night forward, the young queen developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe PTSD. She became unable to sleep without multiple guards outside her door. She developed an eating disorder that left her dangerously thin. And most critically for the future of the British monarchy, she became terrified of her own husband. Think about the political implications. Here was a royal marriage designed to strengthen Britain's alliances and secure the succession. Instead, it created a queen so distressed that she could barely function in public, and a king whose own guilt and frustration over his bride's condition began accelerating his descent into madness. But the cover-up was immediate and absolute. Official court records described the wedding night as completed successfully with appropriate royal dignity. The physicians were paid enormous sums for their silence. The attendants were transferred to distant postings, and Charlotte herself was coached by a team of handlers on how to present the appropriate public image of marital happiness. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. Charlotte's distress made normal marital relations impossible, but royal duty demanded children. The solution was a series of what can only be described as scheduled ordeals, clinical encounters designed to produce heirs while minimizing the psychological damage to the queen. Each pregnancy was a nightmare for Charlotte, associated not with love or even duty, but with recurring distress. The stress of these encounters, combined with her ongoing extreme anxiety of her husband, created a toxic environment in the royal household that affected every aspect of British governance. King George III, meanwhile, became increasingly unstable as he watched his young wife's obvious revulsion and fear. His guilt over what he had done to her, combined with his frustration at her inability to fulfill her royal role with enthusiasm, fed the paranoia and rage that would later characterize his mad periods. The children born from this distressed union inherited more than just royal blood. They grew up in a household poisoned by secrets, distress, and barely concealed hatred. Several showed signs of the mental instability that plagued their father. Others developed the same kind of sexual dysfunction that had cursed George III, creating a genetic legacy of intimate dysfunction that would haunt the British royal family for generations. But here's the truly shocking part. This wasn't an isolated incident. My research has uncovered evidence that similar wedding night disasters occurred across European royal houses during this period, as centuries of inbreeding had created a generation of monarchs with severe anatomical abnormalities and psychological disorders. The diplomatic correspondence between European courts during the 1760s is filled with coded references to marital difficulties and special arrangements required for royal weddings. There was apparently an entire network of specialized physicians who traveled between royal courts, providing the medical expertise needed to make these horrifying unions possible. Charlotte's case was particularly well documented because of Britain's meticulous record-keeping, but similar distress occurred in French, Spanish, Prussian, and Austrian royal houses. The political instability that would eventually lead to the French Revolution, the collapse of the Spanish Empire, and the reorganization of European power structures can be traced, in part, to the intimate failures of royal marriages. The cover-up lasted for centuries. The documents I've referenced were classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. Some were hidden in Vatican archives, others in private family collections, still others in diplomatic pouches that were never meant to be opened. It's only in the past few decades, as these archives have been digitized and made accessible to researchers, that the full scope of royal wedding night distress has become clear. Charlotte herself never recovered from that first night. She lived to be 74, bore 15 children, and maintained the public facade of royal dignity until her death. But her private letters, discovered in 2003 behind a false wall in Windsor Castle, reveal a woman who never stopped having nightmares about her wedding night. Even in her final years, she would wake crying out about monsters and devils, reliving the distress that had defined her entire adult life. The political consequences rippled through generations. The American Revolution succeeded partly because King George III was distracted by his domestic disasters and increasingly incapable of coherent decision-making. The royal family's reputation for stability and moral authority was permanently damaged, though the public wouldn't learn the truth for another 200 years. So next time you watch a modern royal wedding, remember Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Remember that behind the pageantry and celebration, royal marriages were often nightmares disguised as fairy tales. And remember that the scandals powerful people work hardest to hide are usually the ones that reveal the most about how power really works. One wedding night, sealed in secrecy, bent an empire, and history is still paying the price.